Everyone, this is DeFi analyst from TID Research, and in today I would like to talk about some interesting update from Morpho, which is about the V2 vote. So if you go to the UI right now, you can see there's a new toggle available here on the vote page, and that is for the V2 vote. And if you turn it on, you can see there's actually a list of the V2 votes. So V2 vote is interesting in the sense that it's actually an improved version of the V1 votes with more features available. So if, for example, if you go to the V1 vote for, like in this case, Spark USDC votes curated by SparkDAO, in this vote, they can only allocate your asset across Morpho market. So it means that they cannot allocate your asset outside of Morpho. And that is good in the sense that the risk profile for earned V1 vote is pretty straightforward because it's 100% lended. However, it's also bad because it limits the user's choices they can have on Morpho. For example, some user might want to do like lending because it's easy to understand, not necessarily low risk, but easy to understand. So they can choose like lending and then they can do it on Morpho and they'll be pretty happy with the earned vote. And it's all 100% lended. Some user might want to be exposed to leverage staking APY. And then some user might want to have some exposure to like the Curve, Uniswap LP. And then some user might want to have exposure to, for example, option arbitrage strategy. And for Morpho Vote V1, that cannot be achieved because the curators for Morpho Vote V1, they can only allocate to markets on Morpho, which is the lending and borrowing. However, for V2, right now, they allow the curators to allocate to any votes on any DeFi protocol. So as long as the votes on other DeFi protocol are compatible with the Morpho votes feed, curators in this V2 votes can allocate to any of these votes on the outside DeFi protocol. For example, there's some DeFi protocol, for example, Yarn feeds are doing some strategy. For example, like iPore, Fusion, they're also doing some PT looping strategies. And then, for example, like Upshift, they're also doing some like basic trading strategy. And then, for example, Resolve, they also launched their own votes, which is also doing some like leverage staking, REST USR, RLP strategies. It means that Vote V2 right now can actually interact with all this kind of, and it means that Morpho become a yield hub because curator on Morpho can now allocate based on the Morpho infra. They can now interact and allocate users' deposit, not just on Morpho lending and borrowing market, but to all this protocol and then put together some product with different risk profile and with different yield structure to attract different group of users. So this kind of update basically expand the target audience, the size of target audience can have, and then turn from a lending borrowing protocol into a universal on-chain yield protocol. So that is why this update is interesting because it basically means that Morpho users of Morpho right now can interact and have access to all yields out there on any DeFi protocol. So this is the first interesting update for Morpho V2. And the second interesting update is about the granular risk curation. So risk curation, because that is necessary for V2, because that V2 will interact with much more asset compared to one, and they will also interact with much more firm types compared to which is only doing lending. So through the ID system, the curator can label the collateral assets. They can also label the market. For example, the collateral can be rep ETH and the market can be, for example, LP position on Curve. So if I'm doing like a rep ETH LP on, which is not just a random example, for example, I'm doing the rep ETH LP on Curve. So the LP will be the IP of the ID of that position will be rep ETH IDs plus the Curve LP. And then each ID has a corresponding cap. It means that the supply cap. For the rep ETH LP on Curve, because I already have the collateral asset ID, I also have the specific market curation ID. I can come up with a cap that the curator can allocate to the assets and therefore keep the exposure under control based on the online collateral and also the market exposure. So that is what the granular risk curation is about. And all these are public, transparent. So before a user enters into the market, they can understand what kind of strategy this vote is what we'll be doing and how the curators label their different kind of assets, different kind of markets, and what's the risk profile of these votes and what's the risk appetite of this curator. So you can better understand how the curator will manage your money and choose the votes you like. And then last important update about the vote is the in-kind redemptions options. So in-kind redemption means that for Morpho V1, if any of the online lending market, for example, in this case, waiting for it to load. For example, in this case, like StakeHouse USD exposed to all this market. So let's say, for example, right now the CBBTC USDC market utilization rate is 100%. It means that the USDC allocated by Stakehouse into this market will be stuck and then cannot be withdrawn. And it also means that for a user who deposit into these votes cannot withdraw their USDC from these votes. However, Vote V2 introduced the in-kind redemption option. So in-kind redemption means that for anyone, for example, deposit USDC into a given votes, and then the votes allocate your USDC across different kind of market. In-kind redemption allows you to redeem with all these online markets instead of with only have the option to redeem for USDC. And the reason why that is useful because that is from time to time the online market withdrawal might be stuck. And so the situation we just talked about is one of the example. So for example, if the V2 vote is allocated to, for example, the Aave or Compound, for example, the Compound USDC market, and then the Compound USDC market, suddenly the utilization rate spike and then stuck at 100%. It means that the votes allocation to the Compound USDC market cannot be withdrawn. And then for fee, it allows users to still exit the Morpho V2 vote, and then in return, they'll get a basket of the online position. And let's say if the V2 vote is doing, like, for example, Aave lending is also doing like Compound USDC lending. So 50% in the USDC lending and 50% in the Compound USDC lending. And let's say the Compound USDC market utilization rate spike, stuck at 100%. During this period of time, users can still exit the Morph, and in return, the user will get Aave USDC lending position plus the Compound USDC lending positions. And it means that even if the Compound cannot be withdrawn, the user can still exit the Morpho V2 votes. And that is important in the sense that it helps the users at least control their exposure despite the market radical volatility. And that is especially important after we've seen all the incidents from Balancer, from USDX, from Stable Labs, from Elixir, which incur a lot of the users' deposit being stuck in the lending market. And then this is how the in-kind redemption works. Let's say you deposit into and allocate 50% you deposit into the Aave USDC lending, and then 50% you deposit into the Compound USDC lending. And let's say the Compound USDC utilization rate spike. So it means that if you want, cannot withdraw you from the Compound market right now. However, you still want to exit the Morpho fee. That is when you can trigger the in-kind redemption. So when you trigger the in-kind redemption, it will borrow flash loan on your behalf, and then the Morpho will deposit the USDC flash loan into the Compound USDC market, for example. Because the new batch of USDC is deposited, it means that the user can now withdraw the USDC from the online market, which is a Compound USDC market in this case. The USDC withdrawal will be used to repay the flash loan, will be used to repay the flash loan. And then it means that right now, the vote no longer owns anything in that Compound USDC market. And therefore, user can withdraw their full shares for the allocated asset, which is the USDC market, USDC position on Compound. So keep in mind that because of the flash loans, we already repay on behalf of the votes for our position in the Compound USDC market. And right now we own directly the USDC lending on Compound in the market. The user can then withdraw their shares, which still has some USDC allocated in the Aave lending market. And so the user can then walk away with the Compound USDC lending position and the Aave USDC lending position, even though the Compound USDC lending position is stuck and can be backed up. The user can still close the Aave lending position anytime. They don't need to wait till the curator to close their positions because the curators might act a bit too slow. So that is how the in-kind redemption works. This is useful when the market is like very, very volatile and the user want to take control of their own position. They don't want to wait till the curators to step in and then to stop the, for example, potential contingent across different lending markets. That is why the V2 votes can be interesting, because the V2 votes right now, curator can allocate your assets across any DeFi protocol, and then curators, you can also check how curators manage their risk with the Granular risk curation, ID and cap system. And lastly, you also have the emergency exit option where you do the in-kind redemption to control your own loss instead of waiting for the curators to step into your rescue.